Nazi camp in rural Oklahoma, let me tell y'all more about it. Did you know that just 26 minutes away from this exact location, there was once a POW camp for Nazis during World War II? When we learn about World War II, we look at the bigger picture, like what America did, France, Great Britain, and obviously Germany. But what about rural America? Now, during my time at Tipton, I was able to collect a few stories from my history teacher and from a local who got to see the camp with his own eyes. And what I can tell you is this is one of Tipton's most fascinating pieces of history. And there's a few reasons that make this so. However, the ones that we're going to be focusing on today are how did the Nazis get here in the first place, what the dynamic was between the locals and the prisoners, and what the impact was on rural America. How did they get here? Well, first, they were at Fort Sill. And at Fort Sill, they were some of the most troublesome, deviant, and defiant set of prisoners. And Fort Sill was like, no. We gotta move them out to somewhere else. So they moved them to Tipton. Tipton's camp would run from October of 44 to November of 45. And during that time, it held around 250 prisoners. These 250 prisoners would be held on a land owned by the Killebrew family and leased to the government. The reason why this piece of information is significant is because the son of the family, Sam Killebrew, is actually alive today and is the source of this PowerPoint presentation. Now, when we look at the map, their set of land sat right in the heart of what Tipton was. So that means that the prisoners and the locals had more interactions than you would think. Now, let's talk about the dynamic. Obviously, the dynamic was pretty interesting because they were Nazis, but also because their daily routine involved them being in town quite often. One of the accounts from Sam Killebrew is that he remembers playing outside almost daily and seeing these prisoners walk up and down the streets. And think about it in a local's point of view. That has to be pretty scary, just hearing all these things about the Nazis and then watching them right in front of your yard. No, thank you. Now, another story that is my favorite involves the newspapers, like the ones up here on the slide. Now, during the time, America was notable for having some newspapers that had headlines that were really attention-grabbing. And the locals like to taunt the prisoners with these headlines, like the one above that says Nazis quit the war. When the war was finally over, the prisoners was like, we have to show the locals were like, we have to show the prisoners what's going on. So when they showed them the pieces of paper, the prisoners showed a childlike ignorance and were like, no way. Hitler told us that we were gonna win the war, and that's exactly what we're gonna do. It's kind of crazy to see how that they didn't believe it, but it's also crazy to think that we even have these stories to talk about. But it makes sense when we look at the agricultural scene. When the prisoners first got here, the farmers were like, we've gotta do something to keep them from doing what they did at Fort Sill. So they put them to cotton picking. Now when they first got here, they did not understand that cotton picking was so labor intensive, strenuous, and tedious work. They got 80 cents a day, which is pretty interesting when we look at what migrant workers of America were getting at the time, which was only 30 cents. But we won't get into that today. What we will be getting into is how the Germans tried to cheat the system fairly quickly. Now, they have a story that I was told by Sam Killebrew that they were so tired of this work that they were like, listen, we gotta do something to get these 6-foot-long bags filled up pretty quickly. So their solution was to fill up the bag halfway with stems, which are useless, and then the first half with cotton, so the farmers wouldn't find out. But obviously the farmers are gonna know. And when they did, they physically kicked those prisoners off the truck. I guess you can say that's a lesson learned because they never did it again. Like I said before, this type of labor is very, very intense. So what they did was they fed them food that kept them bulky. We're talking about meat, potatoes, and bread. Now, if we look at how the prisoners lived at Tipton, no way in comparison to what the Jews were going through overseas. In conclusion, we talked about how the Nazis got here, what they did while they were here, the dynamic between the locals and the Nazis, and what their impact was on rural agriculture. This is one of Tipton's most fascinating pieces of history, and it's crazy to see that something so big in history, like World War II, has effects that trickle all the way down to a tiny place like Tipton. Thank you.